Hunting with the Bow and Arrow by Saxton Pope. Read by Bambery. Dedicated to Robin Hood, a spirit that at some time dwells in the heart of every youth. Chapter 2. How Ishi made his bow and arrow and his methods of shooting. Although much has been written in history and fiction concerning the archery of the North American Indian, strange to say, very little has been recorded of the methods of manufacture of their weapons, and less inaccurate records of their shooting. It is a great privilege to have lived with an unspoiled aborigine and seen him step by step construct the most perfect type of bow and arrow. The workmanship of Ishi was by far the best of any Indian in America. Compared with thousands of specimens in the museum, his arrows were the most carefully and beautifully made. His bow was the best. It would take too much time to go into the minute details of his work, and this has all been recorded in anthropologic records. But outlines of his methods are as follows. The bow Ishi called Ma-ni. It was a short, flat piece of mountain juniper backed with sinew. The length was 42 inches, or, as he measured it, from the horizontally extended hand to the opposite hip. It was the broadest at the center of each limb, approximately 2 inches, and a half-inch thick. The cross-section of this part was elliptical. At the center of the bow, the hand grip was 1 1/4 inches wide by 3/4 thick, a cross-section being ovid. At the tips it was curved gently backward and measured at the nocks 3/4 by 1/2 inch. The nock itself was square-shouldered and terminated in a pin 1/2 inch in diameter and 1 inch long. The wood was obtained by splitting a limb from a tree and utilizing the outer layers, including the sapwood. By scraping and rubbing on sandstone, he shaped and finished it. The recurved tips of the bow he made by bending the wood backward over a heated stone. Held in shape by cords and binding to another piece of wood, he let his bow season in a dark, dry place. Here it remained for a few months to years, according to his needs. After being seasoned, he backed the bow with sinew. First he made a glue by boiling salmon skin and applying it to the roughened back of the bow. When it was dry, he laid on long strips of deer sinew, obtained by the leg tendons. By chewing these tendons and separating their fibers, they became soft and adhesive. Carefully overlapping the ends of the numerous fibers, he covered the entire back very thickly. At the nocks, he surrounded the wood completely and added a circular binding about the bow. During the process of drying, he bound the sinew tightly to the bow with long, thin strips of willow bark. After several days, he removed this bandage and smoothed off the edges of the dry sinew, sized the surface with some more glue, and rubbed everything smooth with sandstone. Then he bound the hand grip for a space of 4 inches with a narrow buckskin thong. In his native state, he never seems to have greased his bow nor protected it from moisture, except by his bow case, which was made of the skin from a cougar's tail. But while with us, he used shellac to protect the glue and wood. Other savages used buckfat or bear grease. The bowstring he made of the finer tendons from the deer's shank. These he chewed until soft. Then he twisted them tightly into a cord having a permanent loop at one end and a buckskin strand at the other. While wet, the string was tied between 2 twigs and rubbed smooth with spittle. Its diameter was 1/8 inch, its length about 48 inches. When dry, the loop was applied to the upper nock of his bow while he bent the bow over his knee and wound the opposite end of the string about the lower nock. The buckskin thong terminating at this portion of the string made it easier to tie in several half hitches. When braced properly, the bowstring was about 5 inches from the belly of the bow, and when not in use and unstrung, the upper loop was slipped entirely off the nock, but held from falling away from the bow by a second small loop of buckskin. Drawn to the full length of an arrow, which was about 26 inches, exclusive of the foreshaft, his bow bent in a perfect arc, slightly flattened at the handle. Its pull was about 45 pounds, and it could shoot an arrow about 200 yards. This was not the most powerful type of weapon known to Indians, and even Ishi did make stronger bows when he pleased, but this seemed to be the ideal weight for hunting, and it certainly was adequate in his hands. According to English standards, it was very short, but for hunting in the brush and shooting from crouched postures, it seemed better fitted for the work than a longer weapon. According to Ishi, a bow left strung or standing in an upright position gets tired and sweats. When not in use, it should be lying down. No one should step over it, no child should handle it, and no woman should touch it. This brings bad luck and makes it shoot crooked. To expunge such influence, it is necessary to wash the bow in sand and water. In his judgment, a good bow made a musical note when strung and the string is tapped with an arrow. This was man's first harp, the grandfather of the pianoforte. By placing one end of the bow at the corner of his open mouth and tapping the string with an arrow, the Yannick could make sweet music. It sounded like an Aeolian harp. To this accompaniment, Ishi sang a folk song telling of a great warrior whose bow was so strong that, dipping his arrow first in fire, then in the ocean, he shot at the sun. As swift as the wind, his arrow flew straight in the round open door of the sun and put out its light. Darkness fell upon the earth, and men shivered with cold. To prevent themselves from freezing, they grew feathers, and thus our brothers the birds were born. Ishi called an arrow sawa. In making arrows, the first thing is to get the shafts. Ishi used many woods, but he preferred witch hazel. The long, straight stems of this shrub he cut in lengths of 32 inches, having a diameter of 3/8 of an inch at the base when peeled of bark. He bound a number of these together and put them away in a shady place to dry. After a week or more, preferably several months, he selected the best shafts and straightened them. This he accomplished by holding the concave surface near a small heap of hot embers, and when warm he either pressed his great toe on the opposite side, or he bent the wood backward on the base of the thumb. Squinting down its axis, he lined up the uneven contours one after another and laid the shaft aside until a series of 5 was completed. He made up arrows in lots of 5 or 10, according to the requirements, his fingers being the measure. The sticks thus straightened, he ran back and forth between 2 grooved pieces of sandstone, or revolved them around his thigh while holding the stones in his hand, until they were smooth and reduced to a diameter of 5/6 of an inch. Next they were cut into lengths of approximately 26 inches. The larger end was now bound with a buckskin thong and drilled out for the depth of 1.5 inches to receive the end of the foreshaft. He drilled this hole by fixing a long sharp bone in the ground between his great toes and revolved the upright shaft between his palms on the fixed point, the buckskin binding keeping the wood from splitting. The foreshaft was made of heavier wood, frequently mountain mahogany. It was the same diameter as the arrow, only tapering a trifle towards the front end and usually about 6 inches long. This was carefully shaped into a spindle at the larger end and set in the recently drilled hole of the shaft, using glue or resin for this purpose. The joint was bound with chewed sinew, set in glue. The length of an arrow overall was estimated by Ishi in this manner. He placed one end on top of his breastbone and held the other end out in his extended left hand. Where it touched the tip of his forefinger, it was cut to the proper length. This was about 32 inches. The rear end of his arrow was now notched to receive the bowstring. He filed it with a bit of obsidian, or later on, with 3 hacksaw blades bound together until he made a groove 1/8 of an inch wide by 3/8 deep. The opposite end of the shaft was notched in a similar way to receive the head. The direction of this latter cut was such that when the arrow was on the bow, the edge of the arrowhead was perpendicular, for the fancied reason that in this position the arrow when shot enters between the ribs of the animal more readily. He did not seem to recognize that an arrow rotates. At this stage he painted his shafts. The pigments used in the wilds were red cinnabar, black pigment from the eye of trout, a green vegetable dye from wild onions, and blue obtained, he said, from the root of a plant. These were mixed with the sap or resin of trees and applied with a little stick or hairs from a fox's tail drawn through a quill. His usual design was a series of alternating rings of green and black starting 2 inches from the rear end and running 4 inches up the shaft. Or he made small circular dots and snaking lines running down the shaft for a similar distance. When with us he used only dry colors mixed with shellac, which he preferred to oil paints because they dried quicker. The painted areas intended for the feathers is called the shaftment, and not only helps in finding lost arrows, but identifies the owner. This entire portion he usually smeared with thin glue or sizing. A number of shafts having been similarly prepared, the Indian was ready to feather them. A feather he called puuni. In fledging arrows, Ishi used eagle, buzzard, hawk, or flicker feathers. Owl feathers Indians seem to avoid, thinking they bring bad luck. By preference he took them from the wings, but he did not hesitate to use tail feathers if reduced to it. With us he used turkey pinions. Grasping one between the heel of his two palms, he carefully separated the bristles at the tip of the feather with his fingers and pulled them apart, splitting the quill its entire length. This he called stripping a feather. Taking the wider half he firmly held in one end of a rock with his great toe, and the other end between the thumb and forefinger of his left hand. With a piece of obsidian, or later on a knife blade, he scraped away the pith until the rib was thin and flat. Having prepared a sufficient number in this way, he gathered them up in groups of 3, all from similar wings, tied them with a bit of string, and dropped them in a vessel of water. When thoroughly wet and limp, they were ready for use. While he chewed up a strand of sinew 8 or 10 inches long, he picked up a group of feathers, stripped off the water, removed one, and after testing its strength, folded the last 2 inches of the bristles down on the rib, and the rest he ruffled backwards, thus leaving free space for a later binding. He prepared all 3 like this. Picking up an arrow shaft, he clamped it between his left arm and his chest, holding the rear end above the shaftment in his left hand. Twirling it slowly in this position, he applied one end of the sinew near the nock, fixing it by overlapping. The first movements were accomplished while holding one extremity of the sinew in his teeth. Later, having applied the feathers to the stick, he shifted the sinew to the grasp of the right thumb and the forefinger. One by one he laid the feathers in position, binding down the last 2 inches of stem and the wet barbs together. The first feather he applied on a line perpendicular to the plane of the nock. The 2 others were equidistant from this. For a space of an inch he lapped the sinew about the feathers and arrow shaft, slowly rotating it all the while, at last smoothing the binding with his thumbnail. The rear ends having been lashed in position, the arrow was set aside to dry while the rest were prepared. 5 or 10 having reached this stage, and the binding being dry and secure, he took one again between his left arm and his chest, and with his right hand drew all the feathers straight and taut down the shaft. Here he held them with the fingers of his left hand. Having marked a similar place on each arrow where the sinew was to go, he cut the bristles off the rib. At this point he started binding with another piece of wet sinew. After a few turns he drew the feathers taut again and cut them, leaving about a ½ inch of rib. This he bound down completely to the arrow shaft and finished all by smoothing with wet lapping over his thumbnail. The space between the rib and the wood he sometimes smeared with more glue to cause the feather to adhere to the shaft, but this was not the usual custom with him. After all was dry and firm, Ishi took the arrow and beat it gently across his palm so that the feathers spread out nicely. As a rule, the length of his feathers was 4 inches, though on ceremonial arrows they often were as long as 8 inches. After drying, the feathers were cut with a sharp piece of obsidian, using a straight stick as a guide and laying the arrow on a flat piece of wood. When with us, he trimmed them with scissors, making a straight cut from the full width of the feather and back to the height of 1/4 of an inch at the forward extremity. On his arrows, he left the natural curve of the feather at the nock, and while the rear binding started an inch or more from the butt of the arrow, the feather drooped over the nock. This gave a pretty effect and seemed to add to the steering qualities of the missile. 2 kinds of points were used on Ishi's arrows. One of the simple blunt end of the shaft bound with sinew used for killing small game and practice shots. The other was his hunting head, made of flint or obsidian. He preferred the later. Obsidian was used as money among the natives of California. A boulder of this volcanic glass was packed from some mountainous districts, and pieces were cracked off in exchange for dried fish, venison, or weapons. It was a medium of barter. Although all men were more or less expert in flaking arrowheads and knives, the better grades of bows, arrows, and arrow points were made by the older, more expert specialists of the tribe. Ishi often referred to one old Indian named Chuno wa Yahi, who lived at the base of a great cliff with his crazy wife. This man owned an axe, and thus was famous for his possessions as well as his skill as a maker of bows. From a distant mountain crest one day, Ishi pointed out to me the camp of this Indian who was long since dead. If ever Ishi wished to refer to a hero of the bow, or having been beaten in a shot, he always told us of what Chuno wa Yahi could have done. To make arrowheads properly, one should smear his face with mud and sit out in the hot sun in a quiet, secluded spot. The mud is a precaution against the harm from the flying chips of glass, possibly also a good luck ritual. If, by chance, a bit of glass should fly in the eye, Ishi's method of surgical relief was to hold his lower lid wide open with one finger while he slapped himself violently on the head with the other hand. I am inclined to ascribe the process of removal more to the hydraulic effect of the tears thus started than to the mechanical jar of the treatment. He began this work by taking one chunk of obsidian and throwing it against another. Several small pieces were thus shattered off. One of these, approximately 3 inches long, 2 inches wide, and a half-inch thick, was selected as suitable for an arrowhead, or haka. Protecting the palm of his left hand by a piece of thick buckskin, Ishi placed a piece of obsidian flat upon it, holding it firmly with his fingers folded over it. In his right hand he held a short stick, on the end of which was lashed a sharp piece of deer horn. Grasping the horn firmly while the longer extremity lay beneath his forearm, he pressed the point of the horn against the edge of the obsidian. Without jar or blow, a flake of glass flew off, as large as a fish scale. Repeating this process at various spots on the intended head, turning it from side to side, first reducing one face, then the other, he soon hit a symmetrical point. In a half hour he could make the most graceful and perfectly proportioned arrowhead imaginable. The little notches fashioned to hold the sinew binding below the barbs he shaped with a smaller piece of bone, while the arrowhead was held on the ball of his thumb. Flint, plate glass, old bottle glass, onyx, all could be worked with equal facility. Beautiful heads were fashioned from blue bottles and beer bottles. The general size of these points was 2 inches for length, 7/8 for width, and 1/8 for thickness. Larger heads were used for war, and smaller ones for shooting bears. Such a head, of course, was easily broken if the archer missed his shot. This made him very careful about the whole affair of shooting. When ready for use, these heads were set on the end of the shaft with heated resin, and bound in place with sinew, which encircled the end of the arrow and crossed diagonally through the barbed notches, with many recurrences. Such a point has better cutting qualities in animal tissue than has steel. The latter is, of course, more durable. After entering civilization, Ishi preferred to use iron or steel blades of the same general shape, or having a short tang for insertion in the arrowhead. Ishi carried anywhere from 5 to 60 arrows in a quiver made of otter skin, which hung suspended by a loop of buckskin over his left shoulder. His method of bracing or stringing the bow was as follows. Grasping it with his right hand at its center, with the belly towards him and the lower end on his right thigh, he held the upper end with his left hand while the loop of the string rested between his finger and his thumb. By pressing downward at the handle and pulling upward with the left hand, he so sprung the bow that the loop of the cord could be slipped over the upper nock. In nocking his arrow, the bow was held diagonally across the body, its upper end pointing to the left. It was held lightly in the palm of the left hand so that it rested loosely in the notch of the thumb while the fingers partially surrounded the handle. Taking an arrow from his quiver, he laid it across the bow on its right side where it lay between the extended fingers of his left hand. He gently slid the arrow forward until the nock slipped over the string at its center. Here he set it properly in place and put his right thumb under the string, hooked upward, ready to pull. At the same time he flexed his forefinger against the side of the arrow, and the second finger was placed on the thumbnail to strengthen the pull. Thus he accomplished what is known as the Mongolian release. Only a few nations have ever used this type of arrow release, and the Yana seem to have been the only American natives to do so. To draw his bow, he extended his left arm. At the same time he pulled with his right hand toward him. The bow arm was almost in front of him, while his right hand drew to the top of his breastbone. With both eyes open, he sighted along his shaft and estimated the elevation according to the distance to be shot. He released firmly and without change of position until the arrow hit. He preferred to shoot kneeling or squatting, for this was most favorable for getting game. His shooting distances were from 10 yards up to 50. Past this range he did not think one should shoot, but sought rather to approach his game more closely. In his native state, he practiced shooting at little oak balls or bundles of grass bound to represent rabbits, or little hoops of willow rolled along the ground. Like all other archers, if Ishi missed the shot, he always had a good excuse. There was too much wind, or the arrow was crooked, or the bow had lost its cast, or as a last resort, the coyote doctor bewitched him, which is the same thing we mean when we say it's just bad luck. While with us, he shot at the regulation straw target, and he is the first and only Indian of whose shooting any accurate records have been made. Many exaggerated reports exist concerning the accuracy of the shooting of American Indians, but here we have one who shot ever since childhood, who lived by hunting, and must have been as good, if not better, than average. He taught us to shoot Indian style at first, but later we learned the old English methods and found them superior to the Indian. At the end of 3 months' practice, Dr. J.V. Cook and I could shoot as well as Ishi at targets, but he could surpass us at game shooting. Ishi never thought very much of our longbows. He always said, "Too much money," and he always insisted that arrows should be painted red and green. But when we began beating him at targets, he took all his shafts home and scraped the paint off them, putting back rings of blue and yellow, doubtless to change his luck. In spite of our apparent superiority at some forms of shooting, he never changed his methods to meet competition. We, of course, did not want him to. Small objects of the size of a quail the Indian could hit with regularity up to 20 yards, and I have seen him kill ground squirrels at 40 yards. Yet at the same distances he might miss a 4-foot target. He explained this by saying that the target was too large and the bright-colored rings diverted the attention. He was right. There is a regular system of shooting in archery competition. In America, there is what is known as the American round, which consists of shooting 30 arrows at each of the following distances: 60, 50, and 40 yards. The bullseye on the target is a trifle over 9 inches and is surrounded by 4 rings half of this diameter. Their value is 9, 7, 5, 3, 1, successively counting from the center outward. The target itself is constructed of straw, bound in the form of a mat 4 feet in diameter, covered with canvas facing. Counting the hits and scores on the various distances, a good archer will make the following record. Here's Arthur Young's best score, March 25, 1917. At 60 yards, 30 hit, 190 score, 11 golds. 50 yards, 30 hits, 198 score, 9 golds. 40 yards, 30 hits, 238 score, 17 golds. Total, 90 hits, 626 score, 37 golds. This is one of the best scores made by American archers. Ishi's best record is as follows. October 23, 1914. At 60 yards, 10 hits, 32 score. 50 yards, 20 hits, 92 score, 2 golds. 40 yards, 19 hits, 99 score, 2 golds. A total, 49 hits, 223 score, 4 golds. His next best score was this. At 60 yards, 13 hits, 51 score. 50 yards, 17 hits, 59 score. 40 yards, 22 hits, 95 score. Total, 52 hits, 205 score. My own best practice American round is as follows. May 22, 1917. At 60 yards, 29 hits, 157 score. At 50 yards, 29 hits, 185 score. At 40 yards, 30 hits, 196 score. Total, 88 hits, 538 score. Anything over 500 is considered good shooting. It will be seen from that the Indian was not a good target shot, but in field shooting and getting game, probably he could excel the white man.